Well, welcome. We'll try to start on time because we have such a limited, an abbreviated hour. But we are very excited to have this program sponsored by the Spiritual Life Guild. This is a bit of a teaser for a workshop that will follow in February 24th and 25th. But we are delighted to welcome Sister Susan Schorsten and also Gay, who is, I saw here somewhere, from Rock Hill, South Carolina. We'll be talking about spirituality in photography. I know we have people watching at home. We are not going to be using a PowerPoint today. You're not missing anything on the PowerPoint. There's much to be said, and you can imagine the images. But I will hand this off. Is your lavalier mic turned on?
Yes, ma'am.
All righty.
Well, good morning. Good morning. I decided if you're not coming to me, I'm going to come to you. So I may be moving, unless people fill in these seats, I probably will be moving back. I'm delighted to be here, and my disadvantage is that when I've done this program in the past, I usually do it the total in 8 hours plus, and you've asked me to do it in about 5 hours, including today. So I talk fast, so you have to listen fast. You have in front of you an agenda, and I'm just going to quickly do that. But my first part of the agenda tells you the description of spirituality as a spiritual practice. And why I believe is what we're going to talk about, why I believe that spirituality is in fact a spiritual practice. I am not a professional photographer, but many years ago, I knew that I enjoyed taking, listen to my language, pictures, and that I had a good eye. But I didn't have a lot of time, so it was only when I traveled, was on vacation, basically, that I would take pictures. Take pictures. But what I've learned over the number of years is that I really needed to put together my eye, my heart, my spirit, and my camera. And that there was much more that I was missing by just taking pictures. So that brought me to looking, well, I needed a better camera. And I needed to learn how to take better pictures. Better pictures, new camera. And I needed all the technical skills that goes with photography. So I did some of that. I learned some of those skills. And then I decided, enough's enough. Just enjoy the art of photography. So I'm here because I want to share with you some of what I've learned from photography. It's not just the taking or recording of pictures, but it's also what's in the pictures. It's what invites me to be taken, to be recorded. What are those images? And what do those images say about me? What will your images say about you? Dorothea Lange says that our photos are basically our autobiography. I'm going to throw out a lot. And I would have asked you each to do an introduction, but there really are too many here. And I'm just concerned that that will take too much time, and I won't have the time to share with you what I need to share with you this morning. So what I believe is that photography is, in fact, an art, and it is a means of a spiritual practice. And I'll talk a little bit later about what I mean by a spiritual practice. But it can lead us into deepening our relationship with God. And that's kind of the premise, the basics. So today what we're going to do is just do an overview about photography as an art and a spiritual practice. Talk a little bit about spirituality, meditation, contemplation, Visio Divina. We're going to talk a little bit about sensory awareness. How aware are we of our senses? It's important to pay attention to that, to the awareness of our senses when we're looking at photography. The awareness of our language. And then I have handouts for you. I'm going to suggest you do some homework between now and the workshop in February. I will give you a bibliography and also some quotes on spirituality and photography that hopefully will stimulate you in what kinds of pictures might you be looking at recording, at receiving, and will you be able to see differently. In February, we'll meet Friday evening from 7 to 8:30, and we'll start to talk about some of the gifts of photography. At the end, you may want to come up and look. These basically are some of my photos that display the gifts that we'll be talking about, whether it's perspective, light, darkness, shadow, black and white, diversity, framing, storytelling, meaning making. These are many gifts from photography that have applications for our lives and for our spirituality. So that's the agenda for February. You can put that aside now. And somebody asked me if there would be time for questions. I don't think we'll have time for questions by 11 o'clock. But what we'll do, I'll be here till the 11:15 service, and you can come and ask questions if you have questions, or if we have time at the end. I have, Gay is going to be my timekeeper. She's going to let me know when it's 11:45, and I better hurry up. I used to have a friend that I lived with who used to say, wind her up and watch her go. So hopefully you all can hear me. And if you can't, you need to kind of raise your hand. He's raising his hand to say yes. So we're in good shape in the back. So I love to share what I've learned. That's really the reason why I'm here. And it's been such a deep personal experience for me and for my spirituality to enjoy the art of photography. And by the art of photography, I'm saying, yes, there's a science to it for doing dark room, learning all the technical skills and all of that, and professional photographers who are going to sell their wares as a profession and for revenue need all of that. I don't feel that that's what I need, because I don't sell my wares. I love what I'm doing, and so I describe myself as an amateur photographer, because an amateur to me is one who loves what she or he does. I think photography can stimulate our imaginations, our curiosity, our creativity. How many of you feel that you're creative? How many feel that you're not? I don't have a creative bone in my body, you might say. I believe we all are creative, and we have that within us, but it's how do we bring that out? For some, it may be in poetry. For some, it may be in writing. For some, it may be in pottery. For some, it may be in needlework of some kind. In many, many ways, woodworking. But I believe photography is also a way of bringing out our creativity, stimulates our curiosity, and also our imaginations. In essence, we're talking about both the process of receiving images and spending time with the images. It's both and. Originally, when I was putting this together over a year ago for another situation, I talked it only about the process. But then I learned it's really about the results of the process. It's a both and. So that's what we're talking about. The gifts come from both and. Both the receiving of the image and the image that we spend time reflecting with, or praying with, or looking at. Both are important aspects of integrating our spirituality and our photography. I have about 10 goals that I try to accomplish. However, we don't have a lot of time to talk about all 10. So this morning I went through and I thought, okay, of those 10, which are the ones I'm going to share? And then I think I ended up with about 8. So I didn't try to read and say how many. Don't count them. But I think what I'm going to try to do is go through some of them quickly. I really believe that in the workshop what we will try to do is to provide both head as well as heart, our feeling and our prayer. What's the intake, the output, the intake? What can we take in and what can we put out? It's that both and, that's that integration of the experience. Using our head for reflection, for reading, as well as our heart for what is the feeling, the prayer, the experiences that go with. I would hope to deepen your awareness of how can you see more deeply with the eyes of your heart. To cultivate that deeper sense of vision. And I know that's one of your goals, is to look at things from a different perspective. And that's hopefully what I can bring to the workshop, is what might be this ways of looking at seeing differently, and seeing not with just our eyes, but the eyes of our heart. You might want to reflect on that. What does it mean to see with the eyes of your heart? I believe that's in Ephesians. I don't have the quote here exactly, but it's probably on the quote sheet. But what does it mean to see with the eyes of your heart? What does it mean to hear, to listen with the eyes of your heart? Certainly the rule of St. Benedict talks about listening and how important listening is. One of our older sisters told me one time, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Can you listen twice as much as you speak? You might try that sometime in your family, particularly if you're dealing with an extrovert. And then the introvert is just, how do you blend those two? How to deepen your sense of wonder and awe, surprise, removing those blinders that prevent you from really seeing. And how do these learnings from photography help us in our daily life? What are the blinders that we might have that prevent us from seeing the reality before us? Do we have blinders? Do we have cataracts? Do we need to change our lenses? All of these can be learnings from photography. Can you see the world as God sees the world? Do you see you as God sees you? I have an exercise, and we probably won't have time to do this in February, but I've done a workshop where I've passed out mirrors and asked people to look in those mirrors. And who do they see? For one group, I asked them to do that. It was more with their take-home. And one woman came back and said, I don't like what I saw. I saw all the wrinkles. I saw all the aging. I saw all the blemishes. But do you see you as God sees you? We are made in God's image. Do you believe that? When you look at another, do you see God? So hopefully we become more conscious of who and what we are seeing. Hopefully through some of the exercises that I'll suggest that you do, is that you'll see in a different way perhaps our interdependence and our connectedness with one another, with all of humanity, and that we learn that from nature. There's a wonderful book about trees done by a German, someone who just studies trees was his profession. But the book really shares about, we can learn from trees, community living, and living in community. Because the trees, we see what's above ground. What we don't see is below ground. And trees nourish and support and heal and help one another. Fascinating concept. And isn't that what we're about? We often see what's above, but do we see below? Do we see what's inner? And how we need to support and love our interdependence, our connectedness. And to see within ourselves our different strengths and blessings. Hopefully we'll have some time in February that I'll have photos on the table, and we'll ask you each to pick one. And what do you see in that picture? And as you pass that around, others at the table will say, I didn't see that. I had an experience last spring when I was doing this at the oratory in Rock Hill at a retreat. One of the pictures was a moonshot reflected on the water. And one of the women who was there and who had that picture said, this reminds me of an ultrasound. So for any of you are familiar with an ultrasound that's taken during a pregnancy, she had had 5 children, I believe. Now, I never saw in that moonshot an ultrasound. But she was a younger woman, and that's what she saw in the picture. So we see things differently, but how does that help us? What do we learn from that as we're dealing with difficult situations? And how do we practice praying with images so as to deepen our relationship with God? Isn't that what we're all about? Isn't that what we really desire, is to deepen that relationship? And I believe we can do that through photography. The schedule will be flexible and fluid. We will not cover everything I would want to cover, because when I've done this before, as I've said, I've done it in 6, 8, 10 hours, and to confine it to about 5 or 5.5, I won't be able to cover everything. Usually I do an input, and then we follow with an exercise, and we won't be able to do that in February. We'll have a couple exercises, but we won't have as many as I would like. I will provide some input, and that's mainly what I will be doing, but I also am here to learn from you and how you see some things differently than how I might see them. I believe we are all learning from one another. So it's just not my input, but you will learn from one another, and I will learn from you as well. I would encourage you to journal. I'm going to give you some suggested homework between now and February. And I would encourage you to have a journal where you are both putting the pictures and then what's your reflections about what led you to record that image and what your reflection is with that image. So for those of you, how many of you journal now? Some of you do. I'm encouraging that during this time, because I think it's helpful to remember to recall what it was that touched you. What was it that spoke to you? Did God speak to you in some way with this image? So record that. Let that be something that that you treasure and that you keep before you. For me, photography, as I said, is an art. It also gives us a different language with which to share. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the language piece in a few minutes. But I think that our photography and our spirituality can be integrated experiences, and that spirituality and spiritual practices, I'm sure many of you have your own spiritual practices. Some of may use spiritual reading, some of it you may use contemplation, meditation, scripture studies, whatever your spiritual practices are. How many of you do Lectio Divina, where you read the scriptures and you reflect on the words? Well, Visio Divina is you use basically the same process, where instead of taking the word from scripture, you take an image. And you could do this with artwork. You can take an image of the crucifixion, you can take an image of the Annunciation, you can take an image of the flight into Egypt. You can take an artwork, or you can take a photo, and you pray with that. And you spend time in silence, just as you prepare for meditation or contemplation or Lectio or scripture studies. It's preparing that, taking the time to be quiet, to find the right place where you're not going to be as distracted, to do the same thing but with a picture. What's the picture saying to you? What's God saying to you in this picture, in this artwork? So Visio Divina is the new, perhaps, spiritual practice that you can incorporate. And you, as of most today, you can go into the internet and Google Visio Divina, and you can find all sorts of references for that. So if you're interested in incorporating that as a spiritual practice, you can find out more information about it. I think there are times in our lives when, and certainly the past couple years, we've experienced a lot of chaos, both personally and together as communities. And it's at those times when we need perhaps to step back and gain a perspective. And photography can teach us what happens when you're behind the camera, thinking about this, whether you're using your phone or a camera. Are you taking a close-up? Are you stepping back? Are you looking at it horizontally? Are you looking at it vertically? When we're dealing with chaos, when we're dealing with conflict, what's our perspective? Do we need to step back? Do we need to look at it differently? I often use kaleidoscope, where, a kaleidoscope, you can turn it and you're going to see different images. We can do that too with our lives. We look outside and we see some bare trees. And we also see some evergreens. So the bare trees may remind us of the stripping that each of us has experienced at some time of our life. But the evergreens remind us of the hope. Think for a moment, because we've all had the experience of the Ukraine and what's been happening in the Ukraine. So much of what we see on the news are like the bare trees. They've been stripped. The buildings are demolished. People do not have the means. But if you really look into the face of many of the Ukrainian people, what you see is the evergreen, the hope. So what's the perspective? We can learn from, you could pick up a news magazine, and I did this soon after the war began in the Ukraine. I picked up whichever news, Time, Newsweek, whichever one it was, I don't know, and just focusing on those pictures of the faces of the people, of the devastation, different perspectives. We've heard the stories. So from photography, we can learn, particularly in difficult and chaotic times. Many of us talk in our own spiritual life that we've experienced a time of darkness. St. John of the Cross talks about the dark night of the soul. We seem not to be going anywhere in deepening our relationship with God. And so when you look at darkness, when you look at light, what's the light that might be reflecting through? Last night, I woke up sometime during the night, and there was a window above my head to the left, and as I looked out, I saw the darkness of the night, but the stars were magnificent. In the darkness, what is the light shining through? So we can learn from darkness. We can learn about perspective. We can learn about color. We can learn from the being stripped with the trees. We also will look for the new life of buds coming forth. And certainly in North Carolina and South Carolina, we're blessed with, we'll see that long before my family and others in the north will see it. It's that new life that will come forth, and how eager we are to see that new life. But we have to live through the time of the fall, when the trees were stripped, when our lives may be stripped, and what's the new life budding forth. What can we learn from that? So I'd like to move to just a little bit of talk about our spirituality. Each of us has our own definition of spirituality. And if we had time, I would say to you, well, tell me, what's your definition of spirituality? So think for a moment. How would you define spirituality? Is your spirituality different than your religion? What's the difference? Those might be questions to ponder. But when I talk about photography as being an aid to spirituality, as being a means of growth in my spirituality, what I'm saying is that for me, spirituality is a life gift. It's something that has changed, evolved over time. My religion is my beliefs, my values, my traditions, the rituals. That too has changed over time. But my spirituality is something that's very personal to me. So reflect on what is your own spirituality and how photography can be a means of augmenting, encouraging, fostering, enhancing your own spirituality. Thoughts that are out there, thoughts for you to ponder. We have 5 senses. What are our 5 senses? Sight, smell, hearing, tasting, and feeling. Which of those do you savor most? Think which the sense that you just most value. How many would say sight? How many would say hearing? How many would say taste? Do we have any chefs in the room? What about touch? If you're sensate, you're into touching. I was serving in leadership in our community years ago, and one of our sisters, she was always touching things. I said to her, Marilyn, what are you doing? Turning over teacups or turning over to see where teacups came from, etc. She said, Susan, you are so non-sensate. But I learned from Marilyn because then I thought, oh, that must be something I need to develop. So then I started feeling things. I didn't turn over teacups or coffee cups or whatever. But that whole sense of what are our senses and how do we integrate our senses? If we talk about seeing with the eyes of the heart, what's the difference between looking and seeing? What's the difference between hearing and listening? How many of us multitask and we hear the music in the background, but we're really not listening to it? Or we hear the TV, but we're not listening to it. So what's the difference for you between hearing and listening, seeing and looking? Think for a moment of how our senses need to be integrated. Reflect for a moment on bread baking. Could you smell the bread baking? Could you almost taste? What's that going to taste like? Or what about popcorn popping? You can smell it. Can't wait to taste it. You can hear it. So what's the integration? How are your senses integrated? Is that an area you need to think and spend some time with? What about ice cracking? You can see it. You can hear it. Probably can't smell it. You don't want to be touching it, but you could be if you're walking on it. Just think of walking on an icy pond. If you were up in Ohio or Michigan or Wisconsin, you could hear it. You might see it. You certainly are feeling it. You don't want to taste it. So that whole sense of, do we pray with our senses? When we talk about contemplation and meditation, in dialogue with God, Dialogue means that we're not only talking, but are we listening? When we look at our photos, we're seeing what's in the photo, but are we also listening to what perhaps the feeling or the memory that the photo brings back to us? So that whole sense of integrating our senses. And I'm going to suggest that within the next couple weeks, you go for a walk by yourself without a camera or a phone, and you try to quiet the noise within you and just be aware of your senses. Aware of what are you seeing? What are you hearing? Can you taste anything? If you're near the ocean, you might be tasting the salt water. Do you stop to touch something? Is there a smell in the air? I think it's important for us to become more aware of our senses that most of us just take for granted. We don't think about them. We just have them. We also have the internal senses of our intuition, our imagination, our creativity. And how do we integrate our internal senses and our external senses, our physical senses? And in photography, I think we can bring those together. When we talk about language, the difference between taking and receiving. Most of us say we're taking photos, but others would say that we need to be receiving the images. We're open to the surprise, to the element, to whatever might be before us. Are we open as men and women in our church, in our world, in our neighborhood, in our families? Are we open? Difference between receiving and taking. I had the experience this morning in something I was reading and just looking at our Sunday liturgy in the Catholic tradition. And the person who was reflecting was talking about Eucharist. When you think of the words blessed and broken, taste, take and receive, what do you see when you take the Eucharist? What does it feel like? What do you hear in those words, take and receive? Blessed and broken. What do you hear from those words? What's it saying to you about those words? That you need to be blessed, you are blessed, and you need to be broken in order to give to others. Take and receive, blessed and broken, the Eucharist, something that brings us together as community. So reflect perhaps on the words taking and receiving. What's the difference? What's the difference for you? You may also come across the term photo language. And that was developed a number of years ago as a means of communication, particularly with small groups, and particularly with young teenagers, trying to get them to tell their story. Eric Law, who is an Episcopal priest, is the one who developed it more in the United States. And it's that finding pictures that will encourage people to tell their story or to say what they're seeing and feeling in those images that are presented. So you may also come across photo language. And we'll be doing some of that because that's what we'll be doing with some of the photos that I'll be sharing with you and some of your own that you might bring. What do you see within that? What's the photo language? What's the story? What's your story that's in that? And then that whole sense of being open to surprise, being free in some sense, of being spontaneous. You may be walking along, and I've done this a number of times. I'm walking along, and I see something, but I don't consciously see it. And then something says to me, go back. When I go back, I really look, but I see something that I am surprised by. I don't have the picture here, but there's one that I will have the next time that I was at Middleton Place outside of Charleston last spring, and I was walking by and it was like, what is that? And so to stop and to see, to really see, and then how do I record that in some way? So taking, receiving, recording, images invited you. The image invited me to take it. It was at St. Francis of the Springs in wherever that retreat center is here in North Carolina. And again, it was walking through the woods up there in one of the paths, and it was like, wait a minute, what is that? Just a total surprise. I still don't know what it was, but I have a photo of it. And I sit with that at times that's the unknown. That's the discovery. That's the, what is this? And isn't that what it's about so often? So, where's Boykin? I think we need to pass out the folders. What I'm going to do with these, I have my mic on, so what you have, are you 3 different households? You're by yourself?
I say to the children, if you have a hard time sharing, you can each have your own household chat.
So with what's in these, how many do we need here? You will find on the left-hand side, I have to see if my right or left. On the left-hand side, under the agenda, which you already have, is photography as a spiritual practice. Any more? I mean, anybody need one? Anybody have difficult time sharing? Did you get them up here? So for your homework, again, it's always suggested you can do what you need or want to do, but I just have some exercises there. That one is to go for the walk. Second one is to just look at your own language. You might, one of these weeks, just be very conscious, if you can, about when you use the word take, receive, whether you're seeing or looking, listening or hearing, tasting or savoring, feeling or touching. Or you might want to take one of your favorite poems or scriptures, quotes, and in your packet you also have a number of quotes. And what would that say, what does it say to you, and how might you photograph that? What might you look for that's it gives life to that poem or that phrase or that sentence or that life? Gives life to it in scripture or the quote or what have you. Or take a photo, select a photo that you've taken in the past or from a magazine and spend some time with that sense of the Visio Divina. What are you seeing in it? What is it saying to you? You may look at something that you've taken in the past, received in the past, and do you see it with new eyes? Is there something deeper in that? Have you ever looked at one of your photos and say, oh, I never saw that before. I didn't know that was in the picture, because you were focusing on one piece and maybe there's something that you missed. What is that saying to you now? You may look at your photos. What is the memory that it brings back? It may be painful. It may be sorrowful. It may be very joyful. It may be difficult. But it's coming back to you. So where are you now with that? Is it inviting you to forgiveness? Is it inviting you to make contact with someone that maybe you haven't done in a long time, but you've thought about it, but you just haven't done it? So photos can help us deal with some of our unresolved grief. It can also help us deal with our regrets, perhaps. It could help us deal with, wow, that was such a good time. Can I make contact with that person and share that good time? And then the last one was spend some time in front of a mirror. We all like to look at ourselves in the mirror, right? But who do you see? What do you see? Do you want to see it differently? Then there's also a bibliography. I chose not to bring these books, frankly, because I have to pack them up, and we didn't have a lot of time, but I will bring them in February so that if you want to look at any of these books before you would purchase it, you really will have time to do that. We'll have a table over on the side or whatever, and you'll be free to look at them. May give you think, that is one that I'm interested in. Most of the books that I get, and Gay will tell you this, I get from Amazon. I often look for used copies, and then I compare the cost of the new with the cost from the used and shipping cost. And so sometimes with Amazon Prime, it's easier to get, cheaper to get it. Amazon Prime knows our house well. Yes, she says. But she's the treasurer in our house, so she's the one who told me to get Amazon Prime. And then there's quotes on photography and spirituality. There's a whole array there. Again, there's 4 pages. I could have done probably 6, but I tried to limit it. There's more than enough there to just pick one and just spend time with it. So you might set your own pace between now and February and say, yeah, I'm going to do a sensory walk. I'm going to be more aware of my language. I'm going to take a quote a day and just what is it saying to me? I'm going to play with my camera and just take it. I'm going to take the camera to see what image I'm invited to take. And then when you look at that picture, why do you think you took that picture? Was God trying to say something to you? Can you look at it differently? I have 5 minutes? Whew. Any questions? Do I do my best photography when I travel alone?
I'm going to get you to repeat that so that people at home can hear, if you don't mind saying it into the microphone.
Do you do your best photography when you are working alone, when you are walking alone or traveling alone?
Yes, because just as when you generally are meditating, contemplating, praying in that dialogue with God, it's best that you do that sometimes alone. Like if we go to Middleton Place, Gay will say she'll be somewhere and she'll meet me at a time, and I go off by myself. When we were at the retreat center in St. Francis, we were both in hermitages, so I could go out when I needed and wanted to. But I'm much more reflective and quiet. I quiet that inner noise when I'm alone. And I'm not hearing, or I'm not in discussion with somebody else. It doesn't mean that I don't also receive other pictures when we are traveling together. So we might see something that I'll say, oh, I need to stop and look at this.
In your practice, do you focus more on your subject and composition, or do you explore mediums in photography as part of the exploration?
I just receive whatever the image is. And I don't pay as much attention to, well, I guess it would depend. If I'm looking at color, it's like, how can I get the best perspective on this color? So traveling the Blue Ridge, where am I going to see, get the parameters that I'm looking for, in the depth of color that I might be. If I'm trying to frame a picture, and we'll talk about framing, because we all frame our lives and have boundaries, it's what am I trying to get in that frame? And can I use a natural frame? The framing picture up here, you'll see it's a constructed frame, but the picture was taken through the frame.
And for those who are interested in the technical aspects of photography, we think that Martha Holzer is going to do some workshops later in the spring to help with people who really are like, I don't know what to do with this camera at all.
push on this question a bit. I know in at Middleton Place and Middleton Place pretty well, and I'm always amazed at the natural environment there, the birds, the river, the reeds, and the conflict of the fact that it remains as an incredibly beautiful place through the horrible history of social and economic and slavery and other pieces. And so when I'm there in the immediate sense, I see the natural environment and I'm amazed at how it's survived the scars. And so I'd like to think of that in some process.
And I think that it is one of those, the whole piece of diversity and our interconnectedness and our interrelationship, our interdependence. We also see ourselves, we've become, in my mind, so individualistic, and yet we are so interdependent and we're interconnected that no one of us can survive. And yet how the mistakes that we've made, can we own those mistakes and not repeat them? You know, the whole racial issue is something that I think racism, we've got to address that in a very healthy and holy way and look at that from a diversity standpoint. And I think nature can teach us about diversity. You know, the animals, the plants, the trees, what grows together, and not necessarily in competition always with one another. We have become very competitive with one another. But it's continuing to ponder.
Felt like there was there one more hand before we adjourn to the 11:15? And Jenny, did you want to say anything else from the Spiritual Life Guild, except how much gratitude we have for y'all being here and driving up from Rock Hill last night and driving back today, safest of travels.
Thank you.
So much to think about.
And we'll be back in February, and hopefully you'll be back in February.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Thank you.